I was only supposed to be in the house for a few hours, a mere night, just to clear out the last of my grandmother's belongings. The house had been empty for years, left to wither under a shroud of dust and silence. It was a large, old Victorian, and as I walked through the creaking front door, the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The air was thick with the musty scent of abandonment. I flicked on the dim flashlight I'd brought along, its weak beam struggling to cut through the darkness. Shadows danced grotesquely on the walls, twisting into shapes that seemed almost alive. The house was cold, unnaturally so, and a shiver ran down my spine despite the heavy sweater I wore. The first sign something was wrong came in the form of a soft whisper. It was so faint I thought I'd imagined it, a mere trick of the wind, perhaps. I dismissed it, focusing instead on the task at hand. I moved from room to room, packing up old photographs and faded letters. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to follow me, slipping through the walls like spectral fingers. By midnight, the whispers had coalesced into voices, and the voices into words. They spoke of sorrow, of anger, and of something far more sinister. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was my imagination running wild in the solitude. But as I packed away the last of the items from the attic, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted in front of me, and I could see my own unease reflected in the cold air. The attic was a labyrinth of forgotten memories. The boxes were covered in layers of dust, each one a silent testament to a lifelong past. I was about to open another box when I heard a heavy thud behind me. My heart pounded as I turned, only to find nothing but the empty, dark hallway stretching back into the house. The thud came again, louder this time, and I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards. I tried to convince myself it was the house settling, but the thuds grew into a rhythmic pounding, like someone, or something, was trying to break through from below. I bolted down the stairs, the flashlight flickering erratically. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the house groaned under an unseen weight. As I reached the main floor, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The pounding intensified, now joined by a chorus of desperate, wailing voices that seemed to be coming from all directions. I ran to the basement door, hoping to escape through the back, but as I descended the stairs, I found the basement door blocked by an unseen force. The whispers grew louder, converging into a single, tormented scream that reverberated through my skull. I turned around to face the stairs, but the sight that greeted me was enough to freeze my blood. At the top of the stairs stood a figure, its features obscured by the darkness. It was tall and shadowy, with an aura of malevolence that made the air feel thick and suffocating. It reached out a gnarled hand, and as it did, the temperature plummeted further, the walls beginning to close in. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly. The whispers grew to a cacophony of anguished cries, and I could feel a cold, unseen hand gripping my shoulder. I turned to flee, my feet stumbling over the debris as I sprinted through the darkened rooms. The house seemed to twist and stretch, every corridor a maze leading me further into its depths. Eventually, I found myself in the parlor, the once grand room and now a nightmarish tableau of spectral shadows. In the center of the room stood an old, tattered armchair, and in that chair sat a figure, my grandmother. Her eyes were hollow, her face gaunt and expressionless. She raised a skeletal hand, pointing to a corner of the room where a small, dusty mirror stood. As I approached the mirror, my reflection stared back, but it was not my own. The reflection was that of a man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his face twisted in eternal agony. I turned around, but the room was empty again, the whispers gone, leaving only the oppressive silence. I knew then that the house had claimed me, that I was now part of its eternal night. As the darkness closed in, I felt a cold, clammy hand grasp mine, pulling me towards the mirror. My reflection smiled back at me, and I could feel the last of my sanity slip away as the darkness swallowed me whole. It was supposed to be a routine visit, a simple overnight stay in my late uncle's house to sort through his belongings before putting it on the market. Blackwood Manor had always been a family fixture, a grandiose but faded relic of Victorian opulence. Even as a child, I'd heard the whispers of its haunted reputation, but I dismissed them as mere folklore. After all, I had no reason to believe in ghosts. That was, until the night I spent alone in the manor. I arrived just before dusk, the setting sun casting long shadows over the overgrown garden. The manor loomed ahead, its once pristine facade now marred by time and neglect. I parked my car and stepped out, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. I shook it off as nerves and approached the heavy wooden door, its iron knocker rusted with age. Inside, the house was exactly as I remembered from my childhood visits, elegant yet faded, with grand chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and antique furniture draped in dusty sheets. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. I set my bags down in the parlor and began the task of sorting through old letters and personal effects. As the evening deepened, the house seemed to come alive with strange noises. The occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant thud of something heavy falling seemed exaggerated in the oppressive quiet. I tried to focus on my work, but an inexplicable sense of dread gnawed at me. Around midnight, the house grew colder. I could see my breath misting in the air as I shuffled through a box of old photographs. The temperature continued to drop, and I decided to check the old boiler in the basement, hoping it was just a problem with the heating. The basement was dark and musty. I descended the wooden steps, the creaks and groans of the old house echoing ominously. The boiler, however, seemed to be working fine. As I turned to leave, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, just on the edge of hearing. It was as if someone, or something, was murmuring my name. I quickly ascended the stairs, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down to review some old documents. The house seemed quieter now, but the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. That's when I saw it. A shadow flickered across the hallway, too quick for me to discern any details. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light. But as I turned back to my paperwork, I heard it again, a distinct thump, followed by a dragging sound. Curiosity and fear battled within me. I followed the sounds, which led me to the grand staircase. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting eerie, multicolored patterns on the walls. As I climbed the stairs, the dragging sound grew louder, almost rhythmic. At the top of the stairs, I found myself in a long corridor lined with closed doors. The sound was coming from the room at the end of the hall. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, revealing a dusty bedroom frozen in time. The room was adorned with old-fashioned furniture covered in sheets. The moonlight illuminated a large, ornate mirror standing in the corner. The dragging sound had stopped, but the air felt charged with an unsettling energy. I approached the mirror, and as I did, I felt a cold breath against my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. My reflection in the mirror seemed normal at first, but as I stared, the reflection began to change. My face grew gaunt and pale, and behind me, in the mirror, a shadowy figure emerged, a tall, indistinct shape with hollow eyes. I backed away, stumbling over a chair. The shadow in the mirror began to move, its head tilting as if studying me. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, paralyzing me with fear. The figure's mouth opened, and though no sound emerged, I could sense a terrible, oppressive presence. I fled from the room, the sound of my panicked footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that the old house was simply playing tricks on me. I returned to the parlor and tried to distract myself with more paperwork. But the house was far from finished with me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature continued to drop. The shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own, and every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps following me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I was jolted awake by phantom sounds, scratching, whispering, and the occasional heavy thud. By the early hours of the morning, I was a nervous wreck. I decided to leave, but as I gathered my belongings, the front door, which had been ajar, slammed shut with a deafening bang. I ran to the door, only to find it locked from the inside. Panic surged through me as I tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. My phone had no signal, and the house seemed to have absorbed all light and sound. I was utterly alone and trapped. I wandered through the house, searching for another exit, but each door I tried was either locked or led me deeper into the maze of rooms and corridors. The shadows grew darker, more menacing, and the whispers became a cacophony of tortured voices. In the pitch-black hallway, I saw the shadowy figure from the mirror again, standing at the end of the corridor. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through me, and as it began to approach, I felt an icy grip on my arm. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Desperate, I ran to the library, hoping to find some clue or solution. The library was filled with old books and dusty shelves. I searched frantically until I found an old journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. The entries were written in a shaky hand, detailing the experiences of a previous occupant who had encountered the same malevolent presence. The journal spoke of a curse placed on the manor by a betrayed lover who had died in torment. The spirit was said to trap anyone who entered, feeding off their fear and despair until they, too, became part of the house. As I read, the temperature plummeted further, and the shadows seemed to press closer. I could hear the whispers clearly now, a mix of anger and sorrow. The shadowy figure appeared again, closer this time, and I knew I had to find a way out before it was too late. With newfound resolve, I grabbed a candle from the library and lit it, hoping its light might ward off the darkness. I followed the journal's instructions to perform a ritual to break the curse. I scattered salt and read the incantation aloud, but the house resisted, the shadows writhing and the whispers growing louder. Just as the figure reached me, the candle flickered and went out. In that moment of darkness, I felt a cold hand wrap around my throat. I gasped for breath, my vision blurring as I struggled against the unseen force. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The grip released, and the house fell eerily silent. I was alone once more, the oppressive presence gone. The front door creaked open, and I didn't hesitate. I fled from the manor, stumbling into the early morning light. I never returned to Blackwood Manor. The house remained on the market, its sinister reputation only growing. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, but I know one thing for certain: some places are best left undisturbed, and some shadows are better left in the dark. I always prided myself on my practicality, my ability to stay grounded and logical, no matter the situation. That's why I agreed to spend a night alone in Ravenwood House, a dilapidated estate that had belonged to my great-uncle, Edward Ravenscroft. It was a decision made out of necessity. His will required the estate be cleared and evaluated before it could be sold. As an only child and the nearest relative, it fell to me. Ravenwood House was notorious in family lore, a place whispered about in hushed tones. Stories of strange occurrences, ghostly apparitions, and eerie sounds had always been just that, stories. But as I drove up the winding path through the overgrown grounds and saw the house silhouetted against the twilight sky, I couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding. The house itself was imposing, its Gothic architecture both majestic and menacing. The windows were like dark eyes staring out from the decaying facade, and the roof sagged under years of neglect. I parked my car and approached the massive oak door, its intricate carvings barely visible beneath layers of grime. Inside, the air was stale and cold, the musty scent of decay almost overpowering. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the grime-covered windows. The grand foyer was as I remembered from my childhood visits, opulent but eerily quiet. I set my bags down and began my task of sorting through the estate. As darkness fell, the house seemed to shift. The once familiar creaks and groans of the settling structure now felt like whispers and footsteps. I tried to focus on the task at hand, cataloging old furniture and family heirlooms, but my unease grew with every passing hour. The house felt as though it were watching me, its silence heavy and oppressive. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. I could see my breath forming small clouds in front of me. I decided to investigate the source of the chill. The heating system, an old radiator in the hall, was barely functional but seemed to be working. The basement, however, was even colder. I descended the creaking stairs, the darkness nearly complete, save for the beam of my flashlight. The basement was a sprawling space filled with old trunks, crates, and forgotten relics. As I moved among the clutter, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping. I froze, straining to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the far corner, where an old wooden door was half hidden behind a stack of boxes. With some effort, I managed to open the door, revealing a small, musty room that hadn't seen light in years. The tapping sound grew louder, more insistent. I shone my flashlight around, but saw nothing that could account for the noise. I examined the room closely, my nerves on edge. Then I noticed something disturbing, a dusty mirror hanging on the wall, its surface cracked and darkened with age. The mirror's reflection was distorted, the cracks forming eerie patterns. As I stared at it, the air grew colder, and the tapping sound stopped abruptly. My reflection seemed to shimmer and shift, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadowy figure standing behind me in the glass. I spun around, but the room was empty. I decided to leave the basement, my hands trembling. I returned to the foyer, trying to calm myself. I was alone, after all, just a draft, an old house settling. But the house was far from quiet. The whispers had returned, now accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from all around me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the work I needed to finish. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature continued to drop. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate steps echoing through the empty halls. I ventured through the house, following the sound. Each room seemed colder than the last, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move on their own. The footsteps led me to the library, a vast room filled with ancient books and dark wooden shelves. As I entered, the whispers grew to a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. In the center of the room stood an old armchair, its fabric worn and tattered. The chair seemed out of place, its presence almost deliberate. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding. As I neared the chair, I felt a cold breeze and heard a soft, sorrowful sigh. Suddenly, the whispers stopped, and the room was engulfed in silence. The shadows seemed to converge on the chair, and I saw a faint, ghostly figure seated there. It was a woman, dressed in a flowing, antiquated gown, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She looked directly at me, her gaze filled with an anguish that seemed to pierce my very soul. I staggered back, but the figure's eyes followed me, her silent plea for help almost palpable. I felt a chilling touch on my shoulder, and the temperature dropped even further. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows pressing closer. In a panic, I fled the library and tried to reach the front door, but it was as if the house itself was working against me. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me deeper into its labyrinthine depths. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the mournful wails of the spirits trapped within. As I rounded a corner, I saw a figure blocking my path. It was a man, gaunt and spectral, his eyes hollow and his mouth moving in silent agony. I could feel his sorrow, his despair, and it was overwhelming. I tried to push past him, but he reached out a cold hand, and I felt a jolt of icy fear. Desperate to escape, I darted down a narrow hallway, finding myself in a small, dimly lit room. On the wall hung a portrait of a woman, her face strikingly familiar. She was the same woman I had seen in the library. Her eyes seemed to follow me, filled with a silent, tragic story. In a burst of realization, I remembered the journal I had found earlier, a record of my great-uncle's experiments with the occult, his attempts to communicate with the other side. The house had become a prison for the restless souls he had summoned, their anguish now echoing through its halls. I frantically searched the room for a way to appease the spirits. The journal had mentioned a ritual to release the trapped souls, a ritual that involved a specific incantation and the use of an old family heirloom. I had seen an old locket in one of the rooms, a relic that might be the key. I raced back to the parlor, my heart racing as the shadows and whispers closed in. I found the locket, hidden in a dusty drawer, and hurried back to the library. I followed the instructions from the journal, reciting the incantation as best as I could, and holding the locket up to the mirror. The temperature began to rise, the whispers turning to a chorus of relieved sighs. The shadowy figures began to fade, their anguished expressions softening. The house seemed to exhale, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Exhausted and shaken, I made my way back to the front door. It opened easily this time, and I stepped out into the fresh, cool night air. I didn't look back as I drove away from Ravenwood House, the oppressive weight of its haunted past lifting from my shoulders. I never returned to the estate, and it was eventually sold and renovated. But to this day, I sometimes hear the echoes of that night, the whispers of Ravenwood House, a reminder of the restless spirits that once roamed its darkened halls. The day I arrived at Eldridge Manor, the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, casting long, sinister shadows over the estate. The sprawling Victorian house stood silent and foreboding atop a hill, its once grand facade now weathered and peeling. It had been years since anyone had lived there, and I was the first to set foot inside since my great-aunt Lillian's passing. The task was straightforward: sort through her belongings and prepare the house for sale. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, I felt an icy chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The interior of Eldridge Manor was as I remembered from my childhood visits, opulent but decaying. Dust-covered chandeliers hung from the ceiling like skeletal remains, and the wooden floors creaked with every step I took. The air was thick with the musty scent of disuse. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease as I began my work. Nightfall brought an oppressive darkness. The house seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and writhe. I lit a few candles to ward off the encroaching darkness and set up a small workspace in the library, where my great-aunt had spent most of her time. As I sorted through old letters and trinkets, I heard faint, intermittent thuds coming from the upper floors. I dismissed them as the house settling or perhaps rodents in the walls. But the sounds grew more distinct, a rhythmic, deliberate knocking, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I ventured upstairs, my flashlight casting eerie beams across the walls. The knocking was louder now, emanating from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. I approached the door, hesitating as the temperature seemed to drop further. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The bedroom was dark, the only light coming from the dim beam of my flashlight. The room was filled with antique furniture, draped in white sheets. In the center of the room stood an old wooden wardrobe, its doors slightly ajar. The knocking was coming from inside. My heart pounded as I approached the wardrobe. The knocking stopped as I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. I pulled the doors open, revealing the dark, empty space inside. There was nothing there, just the scent of old cedar and dust. Suddenly, the bedroom door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight flickering wildly. The knocking began again, louder and more frantic. I tried the door, but it was locked, the handle unyielding. Panic surged through me. I turned back to the wardrobe, hoping to find some hidden mechanism or clue. As I examined it, I noticed a faint inscription carved into the wood, "The Watcher." A shiver ran down my spine. The knocking grew more insistent, and I could hear the faint sound of whispering. I tried to push the wardrobe aside, but it was heavy and immovable. The whispers grew louder, forming words I could almost understand: pleas for help, warnings of danger. Desperate to escape, I searched the room for another exit. I found a small, ornate key hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. My hope soared as I inserted it into the door's lock. With a click, the door opened, and I stumbled into the hallway. The manor was silent again, the oppressive weight of the darkness pressing down on me. I decided to leave, but as I made my way to the staircase, I felt a presence behind me. I turned around, but saw nothing. I descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The whispers returned, growing louder and more urgent. The cold seemed to follow me, wrapping around me like a freezing fog. In the foyer, I found a small door leading to the basement. I had ignored it earlier, but now I felt compelled to investigate. With a deep breath, I opened the door and descended the creaking steps. The basement was a labyrinth of old storage rooms and forgotten furniture. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I shone my flashlight around, searching for any clues. The whispers grew louder, coming from the far corner of the basement. There, I found an old trunk, its surface covered in dust and cobwebs. The whispers seemed to be coming from inside. With trembling hands, I opened the trunk. Inside, I found a collection of old journals and photographs. One photograph stood out, a picture of a man with hollow eyes, standing in front of Eldridge Manor. The man's face was twisted into a haunting expression of fear and sorrow. I recognized him as my great-aunt's husband, who had disappeared mysteriously years before. The journals were filled with frantic writing, detailing my great-aunt's obsession with a dark presence she believed haunted the house. She spoke of the Watcher, a malevolent entity that observed and tormented those within the manor. Her final entries were filled with despair, describing how the Watcher had claimed her husband and now sought to claim her as well. The realization hit me like a cold wave: the Watcher was not just a myth. It was a real, malevolent presence that had been lurking in the shadows of Eldridge Manor. I had to leave before it claimed me too. As I hurried back to the stairs, the temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers turned into a chorus of anguished cries. The basement seemed to shift and warp, the shadows lengthening and closing in. The knocking returned, louder than ever, coming from every direction. I raced up the stairs, the darkness closing in around me. The front door was locked again, the handle cold and unyielding. I could hear the Watcher's whispers growing louder, its presence palpable. With a final, desperate effort, I forced the door open and stumbled into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I ran to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I drove away from Eldridge Manor, not daring to look back. As I left the estate behind, I could feel the Watcher's gaze on me, its presence lingering in the darkness. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting in the shadows. Eldridge Manor remains abandoned, a silent testament to the malevolent force that resides within.